Today we have Wizzie Brown with us, and she's going to talk to us about bringing some of our pollinators to our landscape. Wizzie is a extension program specialist with Integrated Pest Management with Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service in Austin, Texas. She received her Bachelor's of Science in Entomology from The Ohio State University and a Master's of Science in Entomology from Texas A&M. After leaving Texas A&M, Wizzie worked in the structural pest control industry before taking a job with Texas A&M AgriLife Extension. And we are super excited to hear what you have to say today, Wizzie. I'm going to let you take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Allison and Danny. I appreciate it. All right, so I am really excited about talking about bringing pollinators to our yards. This is something that I have been working on in my yard for the past year, and it kind of gave me the kick in the butt I needed to do some of these little projects that I have been wanting to do, and I just been putting off and putting off. So I will show you pictures while we're doing the presentation of some of the items that I have purchased and created and added to my own pollinator garden in my yard. And my slide does not seem to be advancing. There we go. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to talk about are flower types. So this is kind of the point of drawing in the pollinators, is that we want to attract them to the plants that we have in our yard so they can help to pollinate them. And on this slide, we have it broken up into two real basic types of flowers. We have an open access flower, which you see with the picture on the left. And essentially, this is going to allow any insect at the pollen and nectar in the flower. And it's not really efficient at getting pollen onto the insect body. It's just if they're tumbling around in the right area, then the pollen goes on there and may or may not possibly stick to the insect's body. So these type of flowers are essentially going to need a lot of insects to visit them so they can actually have pollination occur, because it's not directing the pollen onto the insect specifically, and then again, it's not directing the pollen onto other flowers when that insect travels to the next flower to get other resources. So the flower type that you see on the right is a restricted access flower. And these are going to have specific shapes that they are using to target specific types of insects. And the benefit of these is that they actually can manipulate where they are placing flower onto those insects, and as well as on the next flower that that insect will actually visit. And there are some flowers that actually, or some plants I should say, that do this in a progressive stage. So as the insect, if they land on the bottom, that will have pollen available, and then that insect will carry the pollen up to the newer flowers that have opened at the top, and they'll transfer that and actually pollinate those as they go. So the benefit of this is that these are going to have more accurate pollination needs. So they require less insects to actually visit them for pollination to actually occur. So moving on from, I guess not flower types, but plant types, we're going to talk about food. So insects are going to need different types of food, and these can be provided in the landscape with not only flowers and grasses, which are typically what people think of when they talk about pollination, but also trees. There are a lot of trees that can provide this as well. So these can not only provide pollen and nectar, but they can also provide foliage for a variety of insects. So when we think of pollinators, we typically think of butterflies, we think of bees, and we know that they don't have chewing mouth parts. But if you think about butterfly larvae, which are caterpillars, they are going to need foliage to feed on. And so these plants are also going to be able to provide the food for the immature stages of those insects. So when we are planning a landscape, there are certain things that we want to keep in mind. We want to make sure that we have a succession of flowering plants. And this is easier to do in certain parts of the United States. Since I am in Texas, you know, we can have stuff blooming pretty much year round, but I am from Ohio, and I can tell from experience that that does not happen up there because, you know, you have winter for a certain period of time and you don't have those flowering plants. But the insects have adjusted to those different habitats, and they are going to emerge at the period of time that they need to get to those. But you need to incorporate that succession of flowering plants for the area where you are personally located. The other important thing is something that you see in the photo on the bottom right of the slide. You want to plant clumps of the same flowering plants so you get a kind of a maximum attraction or a real punch towards the insect to get them to come into the landscape. You can't necessarily plant just one of each plant that you like. When I first got into gardening, I would just go to the garden center and kind of, oh, I like this plant and this plant and this plant. And so I would come home with different kinds of plants, but there weren't these large clumps. And so it was more difficult for those insects to find those plants. You also want to work on including a variety of colors because insects are going to be attracted to different colors. Yellows, pinks, reds, blues, purples, oranges. There's all different colors that are available. And then you also want to have different types of flower shapes because those shapes are going to target different types of insects based upon their mouth parts. And we'll talk more about that in the next few slides. The other big one, this is very important. These are plants that we want the insects to come in and visit, and we want them to come in and use it as a food source. So you need to be very, very careful about using insecticides around these plants and on these plants. So one of the big things that I'm going to talk about is letting nature be nature. And if you are someone who wants to have a pristine garden with no plant damage from insects or whatsoever, then having a pollinator garden may not necessarily be for you because you need to have the damage because, as I said, things like caterpillars are going to be feeding on those plants, and that is an important step to this process. So when we talk about flower shapes, I'm just going to cover the common ones. I'm not covering absolutely everything. I'm not a horticulturalist, I'm an entomologist, so I focus more on the bugs, but this is important. So tubular is a pretty popular flower shape, and you can see some examples here. These are going to be great for things like butterflies and moths that have that real long proboscis or tongue-like mouthpart. It also works for some bees. You can see the bumblebee on the bottom left there. And it has that long tongue-like mouthpart that can fit down into that long tube. So these flowers are going to be kind of like a trumpet horn. They have that tapered part, and the nectar reward is going to be at the bottom of that. These are also going to be great flowers for things like hummingbirds, and a lot of people like hummingbirds in their yard as well. And I tend to find that people, if they're attracting pollinators to their yard, they also tend to have things like hummingbird feeders and wanting them to come into the yard as well. The next type of flower shape is a ray shape or a flat shape. And you can see that this is more accessible to a variety of insects, and they are going to be easier for things like beetles to come in. We also have various bees. We have flies. Flies can also act as pollinators. And then these can also be resting places or basking places for things like butterflies and moths as well. Umbels are a kind of a flat cluster of flowers that are little tiny trumpet-shaped flowers. And these are, again, good for things that have longer mouth parts, so things like bees, flies, butterflies, moths, beetles. Since they have a larger landing area than the tubular shapes, it can be more accessible for things like beetles. And these do tend to be a shorter trumpet shape, and they're not as elongated as the first type that we are. So some of those pollen and nectar resources are going to be more available to a wider variety of insects there. And of course, there are other type of flower shapes. We have funnels, we have whorled, shallow bell shapes, different things like that. So you can see some of those on here. We have on the left there, that's a passion flower. In the middle, that's actually a peanut blossom. My son decided that he's going to try his hand at growing peanuts, and that's what the flower looks like. And then on the right, we have some Turk's cap. So this is a good slide that kind of shows you a general landscape. I mean, it's not completely crowded, but you can see how they are clumping the different colors together, and the similar plants are going to be in the same area to provide that really maximum impact to attract those insects in. The other thing that I want to point out, and this is important when we get to talking about the next thing, which is the shelter, is to plant things at different heights. So you can see that there are lower things down there like the lamb's ears. We have some taller things like the grasses and the salvias. We have the taller yarrow in the back. But then we also have some understory shrubbery as well as the upper canopy trees in here. And that is going to be another important thing that we need to talk about, because not only do insects need host plants, but they also need a place to rest. Excuse me. So host plants are going to be essential for the survival of certain insect species. I'm sure everybody knows about the monarch butterfly and how they are specific to milkweed, and all of the things that are going on with a decline of that population. So you can see that some insects are going to be very tied to certain types of plants, and it can be very important for you to give information about or to give those plants in the landscape if you want to draw in those particular insects. So for some insects, they are going to feed on one plant or a small group of plants, like a family of plants. But then there are others that are more generalists and will feed on several different types of plants. So you can find resources for good host plants, whether those are nectar plants or if those are going to be host plants for the larvae like caterpillars. You can get those from your local extension site, or the Circe Society has a great list that you can see there. And then the other one, this was one of the things from a local group here in Austin. It's the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center, and they actually have special collection tools, and you can put in the search list what state you're in, if you want it to be an annual plant or a perennial plant, if you want it to be evergreen or deciduous, and it will pull up a list of plants for your area. So the wildflower collection that you're looking for is the BAMONA collection, and that essentially stands for Butterfly and Moth of North America. And if you type that BAMONA into the Wildflower Center search box, it will bring up that collection, so you can choose the plants that are going to be good for the butterflies and moths that are in your particular part of the world. All right. So foliage, we talked about this briefly. We're going to have not only nectar and pollen resources, which you'll see some of those on the next slide, but we also have a variety of caterpillars that will feed on particular types of plants. So you can see here we have a queen caterpillar that's on tropical milkweed. We have a Gulf fritillary on passion vine, and then on the right we have a black swallowtail caterpillar on rue. And this is not only fun to watch for yourself, but it's a great learning tool for people of all ages. Kids especially like going out into the garden and watching the life cycle of these insects, because you can see the eggs, you can see the caterpillars in different stages, and then you'll actually have the adults and the pupal cases to look at, and it's a lot of fun to watch that. So you can see nectar and pollen. There are a variety of different types of flowers and a different variety of insects. I tried to find some images I had of some uncommon ones that people don't typically think of. You can see that there are some butterflies on here, but I also have on the bottom right, that is a robber fly that you see, and while it's predaceous, it still will take nectar. The top middle picture, you actually see some flower beetles. They will be feeding on the pollen in the flowers, so they're not going to hurt anything. We have on the left, we have a hoverfly over there, and then just some different wasps and bees that you see. Okay, so moving on to the shelter part. Plants are going to need to be in layers, and when you are planning your landscape or adjusting your landscape, you need to think about this in terms of not how the plant is when you purchase it, but how it is going to be when it is fully grown. So you're going to need to make sure that you have a canopy with trees, a lower canopy with some maybe understory trees. We have shrubs, and then lower we have grasses and the herbaceous plants. The other good thing for providing shelter for different pollinators is leaving a little mess. And this is one of those let nature be nature kind of things. I think a lot of times in our landscape, we get very wrapped up into making everything look perfect, like it should be in a magazine spread or something like that. And when it comes to those leaves that are falling on the ground, or the sticks and twigs or things like that, that may possibly be overwintering sites for different types of insects, we are pressed to clean those up right away. And that may not be the best solution. It may be better to leave some of those so those insects can have a place to hang out or lay eggs or rear young or whatever they're doing. This also plays into the next one, rocks and bare soil, not mulch, not covered with plants, just actual soil areas. And we'll talk more about these in a little bit. And then we also have our handmade or artificial habitats that you can create or purchase, and we have some ideas that I can give you on those. So this is just another example of how you can plan those different layers in your yard. You have the trees, you have the shorter understory trees, you have the shrubs, you have ground cover, different various areas. There's even some bare soil that is available there in the front of the landscape bed. You can see there where the grass has died. I decided not to worry about it, and I would just leave that for any ground nesting bees or even mud daubers that might need to pick up mud for their nests. So the nesting sites, as I said in the earlier slide, bare patches of ground can be a huge one. And you can see that up in the upper left-hand section. I have lots of areas of bare patches of ground. And instead of covering with mulch, I have somewhat given up and I have just left it. I do have some dogs that are in my backyard, and where they run a lot on the grass, they tend to leave trails, and instead of trying to fix them, I have just let them go. And, you know, it's kind of spread and it's not a big deal. So about 70% of bees will actually nest in the ground. And these are going to be a lot of our native species of bees. And they are actually going to be solitary. So usually when people talk about bees, they talk about honeybees. And those are going to live in hives. And that's typically where people's brains go. But the native bees that are solitary are going to be excellent pollinators, especially if you are using native plants. Some other ones that you can see up at the top, I created one that was made with bricks. So you can see that those have little holes in them. You can also make these if you have mud or clay soil, and you'll want to poke little holes in there, kind of like make little adobe bricks out of those, put them in a mold, and then poke some holes in them. And you can have bees that will fill those areas in with mud or other materials that they will either nest in or that they can rear their young in. The top right, you see a brush pile. This is also in my backyard. And we have left that there. I don't know how long it's going to stay there because it can also draw in things other than what I want. But these are good habitats for things like bumblebees. If you use a brush pile like that as a bumblebee habitat, you want to make sure that it's going to be a sheltered location, that there's not going to be a lot of rain that kind of drips down through the pile, but they will get into those areas. And a lot of times people will put a stack of firewood away from the house so you're not drawing those insects toward the house. But you want to kind of leave that uncovered because the bees can actually nest in those areas as well. So on the bottom, you see some of the artificial nesting sites. And we have on the left a nest block. That one is going to be just a 4x4 piece of lumber that has holes drilled into it. And that is not going to really work for things like mason bees because the holes are not deep enough. But it will work for blue orchard bees because they are going to be able to utilize a shorter nesting space. And then the ones on the right are going to mimic essentially the same thing, but it's a different concept. So we have one that has bamboo sticks in it. That's the one that's hanging on the tree in the middle. And that's just cut pieces of bamboo that they are putting into that structure. And then on the right, we actually have one. It is just a round plastic container. You can make one of these yourself. And that has cardboard tubes in it that you can take out and replace. And there are going to be some benefits to some of these that we'll talk about, not in the next slide, but the next one. So this one right here, I want to point out, this is also in my yard. So this is leafcutter bee evidence. So this is one of those, I get really excited when I see this, but a lot of people will send these type of images to me and they're wanting to know what they can do to take care of whatever is doing this to their plants. And it's not something that I really recommend that people control because these are bees that are producing other bees, the next generation of bees that are going to be pollinators. So this is one of those, if you see something like this, leave it there and know that you have those pollinators in your yard, and you know that's something that you should be really happy with. So the bee boxes, this kind of gives you kind of the depth on some of them. So you can make these yourself if you want to do that. You don't have to necessarily purchase them. I purchased all of these, but you could make these. So on the top left, you just essentially need a container of some sort. It doesn't have to be round. It could be whatever shape you want it to be. And you will fill that container with tubes. And if you want to do tubes, you can either purchase the cardboard tubes that you see like in that particular box, or you could use rolled newspapers. You can use a dowel and actually roll those pieces of newspaper up and tape those closed and put them in there. Or you could use bamboo pieces. So the slight downfall that you may have with bamboo pieces is that, excuse me, there are going to be uneven diameters of the openings that are available. And the other one is you may not have a full piece of bamboo that is long enough to host things like the mason bees, because a lot of times with bamboo you'll have the sections and it actually closes off where it has that nodule. So if you don't want to do the nesting tubes, which that is essentially what I prefer to do, is the nesting tubes. And the reason why is you need to make sure that you clean it out once the bees have emerged the following year. And the nesting tubes make that really easy to do because you just pull out the used tubes and you pop in a new one, and that's done. If you use something like the bee box that you see in the middle picture there, that is going to have to be cleaned and sterilized once all the bees emerge. And you know, you can make that one, you just drill holes into a wood block or a log. You want to make sure that if you use lumber, that it is not treated. And you want those holes to be a depth of 3 to 5 inches long, depending upon, excuse me, what type of bee you actually are hoping to attract. So mason bees, if you want females produced, which is kind of important if you want to have them mating and doing the same thing the next year, you need to have a longer length of tube available to them. The other bee that you see on the left and then the upper right is it somewhat dismantled. This is a wooden nesting box that you can actually take apart, and it makes it very easy to clean out those nests the following year because you can take off each of those pieces and clean out those tubes. You can also use this to teach others about what you're doing, because when you remove that, you can actually see the cells that are in there and you can see how they're formed. So when you're doing these, you want to hang these on the east side of a building so it gets morning sun. You want it in a sheltered location, and you want it about 5 feet up the structure. This is another one that it is not going to attract a specific type of insect, but this is a great project that you can do. This is just a large kind of vegetable can, kind of the Mondo one that you would get in like a school kitchen or something. You can either purchase those cans or you can get them recycled from restaurants or schools or any type of commercial place that would be using large amounts of food. And then it's just used with found materials. So I have pine cones, toilet paper tubes, paper egg cartons, sticks, shredded paper. There's just a whole bunch of different items in there. And you can either place this on the ground, or you can essentially hang it on a fence or the side of a wall or a tree or whatever. You also don't have to use a can. You can use this in whatever container that you can find. So this is still, it's going to provide shelter for the various insects in the habitat. So this is the leaf litter. A lot of people, when they see this, they need to clean it up. And leaf litter can be an important place for things to have insulation from the cold when they are overwintering. So it's going to be important to leave at least some of it. I'm not saying you have to leave all of it on the ground, but it is important to actually shelter them from some of that cold when they have those really chilly temperatures. All right, so the last one that we're going to talk about is water. So we've talked about food, we've talked about shelter, and now we're moving on to water. So when you're talking about water for insects, you can create water dishes for them, but they do have certain requirements. We also have things like puddling dishes, moist mud baths, you can do drippers, and then of course plants, when we water or it rains, they are going to sometimes hold moisture in them, and some insects can use those to get water. So who and what the water is for is going to determine what they go to have that water supplied to them. So here are some more examples. These are probably, these are the so-so examples when we're talking about dealing with water specifically for insects. So a lot of people are just like, oh, what, you know, I have a bird bath in my yard and, you know, insects will go to that. Or I have a bucket of water for my pets outside. Yes, those are available. And if there are not other water sources, the insects will go to those areas. But if you think about a bird bath, there are possible problems with the bird bath and insects going to it. The first one is birds also go to bird baths and birds will eat insects. So that may cause issues for you having your pollinators there. So that's something to think about. The other thing is there can be a lot of water in the bird bath area. And if that's the case, the insects may possibly drown in that deeper water. So when we're focusing on getting water to insects, we want to make sure that there are safety measures in place. So on the right, this is a pond, and this is another one that a lot of people, well, I have a pond in my backyard. So depending upon what your pond looks like, it may or may not be a good area for insects to get water. The particular pond that you see on the right there, this would be an example of something that is good for insects to get water from because there's lots of vegetation in there that the insects can stand on and hang on to so they're not falling into the water and actually drowning. If you don't have a lot of plant material in the water that would make it safe for those insects to move into the area, then that may not be the best water source for the insects in your yard. Here are some other ideas for watering if you don't want a pond or something large. You can do water dishes, and these are 3 that I have in my yard. The auto water, I don't normally keep that one out, but that you can see is a pet watering dish. This is for those that don't want to refill, you know, every couple of days. You just let it go, and when you refill it up, when it runs out, and you're good to go. But you can see that I put some little glass pieces down in there so the insects have something to stand on while they're getting that drink. The one on the right there, that is just a small, shallow dish that is typically used for catching water when you're watering your houseplants. And you can see I put some small pebbles in that one and filled it up with water so it's safer for the insects. And then the bottom middle, that one actually has a mixture of stones at the bottom, and then I put in some of the glass to give it some color. And then I added some shells, and then my son decided to decorate it with the green army man, which apparently is fighting some unknown, I don't know what. But that one, again, it's a great place, and they can go in and not have to worry about drowning. They may be taken aback by the green army guy, but, you know, what can I do? So here are some other ideas. If you have a downspout area, you can block that a little bit to slow down that water flow and make that an area for the insects to get water. And that may not have water in it all the time, so you may want to supplement that with some of the other ideas. But you can certainly turn that into a safe area for those insects to drink from. And you see that one on the right. The top left is just an old iron pot that I picked up from somewhere, I don't know. Throw some large rocks in there, fill it with some water, and again, it's good to go. So again, you may not have to go out and buy specific supplies for this. See what you have in your house already, and you can modify things to be able to use them. And then the bottom picture, I love this one. A friend of mine actually created this, and she used this part of her drip irrigation system. She set up a dripper into the concrete paving stone, and so it constantly drips a little bit of moisture on that area, so it actually is enough water that they can get a drink, but not enough that they're going to drown. I thought that was extremely clever, and I actually want to steal that idea for my own yard, but I haven't gotten around to it yet. So here are some other ideas. If you have chickens or some sort of bird that you take care of, you have waterers for those. Those can also be used for insects because it's not a deep amount of water. It's going to be a shallow amount of water. So you see that in the top right. The left is another one that I often get calls on. This is a hummingbird feeder that is covered with bees. And usually the call that I get is, how can I get the bees away from the hummingbird feeder? And I am not trying to encourage that because bees are needing food as well. So, you know, let them have some of the nectar too, and just know that you're helping them out. And then the bottom right is something that I actually built yesterday. I haven't cut the zip ties down yet, but this is essentially a soaker hose that I zip tied together to create a planter. And then you put the soil inside, you plant your plants. And when the soaker hose turns on, it not only waters the plants that are inside of there, but it also provides a safe area for insects to get water. Puddling is a little bit different than just actual water. This one is used by butterflies, and they use it to not only obtain moisture, but they also get things like minerals and salts. And you see in that upper left picture, them doing it naturally. So you see that muddy area with the puddle, but you can create a puddling area in your landscape for butterflies. And this again is a shallow plant dish that catches water. And I put in some compost, soil, garden soil, not, garden soil, not like planting, potting soil. I put some sand in there, and then I moistened it. I created a little divot in there to simulate the puddle area, and then I also put a rock. So you can do that. The other idea that you can do is putting out like a chip and dip bowl or something like that, or you could put a shallow dish in with your other puddling dish and provide some fruit so they can get some sugars as well. So that's going to attract flies and butterflies that will come into the area to get those sugar resources. And so you're going to want to put those in sunny areas that are near those plants that you want pollinated. So other possibilities to include in the landscape, we have another sugar source that you see on the bottom right there. That is a suet feeder, and I have some cantaloupe rinds that are left over from when I was cutting up cantaloupe. Bare patches of ground we talked about for egg laying and nest construction. And then the other one is the two that you see on the left. Those are going to be basking areas. And that can either be a large rock in the landscape or a log of some sort, just some sort of space in the sun that the insects can go and warm up when they need to get that sunlight to really get moving in the morning. So remember when you're doing this to provide water, food, and shelter for your pollinators. You want a variety of color, shapes, and bloom times throughout the season. And then, as I said before, let nature be nature. A lot of times we try to make things look a little too pristine, and that's not really how nature works. So make sure that you are open to allowing a little bit of mess into your landscape to encourage those pollinators to come in. So that is all I have. I am going to turn it back over so you can learn about the next talk that we're going to have coming up. And then if there are any questions that I can answer, I would be happy to do so.
Hey, thanks, Wizzie. That was really good information. I really like the part about letting nature be nature. Does anybody have any questions? And I think we probably have some poll questions to put up for you guys to answer. Well, we have one question that says, sorry I came in late, but will we be able to access this online in a video? And yes, it usually takes a few days, but all of our webinars are archived on the All Bugs Good and Bad website. So here's another question. Are some bees nasty or aggressive or to other types of bees?
They can be. Some of them are going to be territorial. And of course, all bees that are female are capable of stinging you as well. It's just that some tend to be more aggressive than others. So you always need to be aware of your surroundings, but as long as you're not honing in on their territory or anything like that, they're not going to disturb you. And as far as them attacking each other, again, that's a let nature be nature thing. That's just kind of par for the course sometimes.
Denny says that our webinar link should be, for the recording, will be ready on Monday. And then Jean is asking, do you have any suggestions for balancing undesirable wildlife with pollinator habitats?
Ooh, that's a tough one. It really depends on what your undesirable wildlife is. If you can, like for the fruit, when I was putting that out yesterday to take a photo, my husband's like, what are you trying to do? Trap rats? And it's like, not really, but yes, that could happen. You can try to make it so they can't access that by maybe using the suet feeders higher up and dangling it from tree branches that may be a little bit more difficult to get to for some of that wildlife. But it really, like I said, it depends on what wildlife you are doing. If you have deer in your area, then you're going to need to make sure that you adjust your plants that are going to work for pollinators, but not necessarily be attractive to the deer for them eating. And, you know, rats, you can trap them, or if you have other wildlife, you can do live traps and things like that to kind of keep them out of your area. But if you're concerned about putting out food, then you can certainly skip that and just do the puddling for the butterflies, because that's not going to really attract them as they will the butterflies.
Okay, and the next question is, I know this is very much dependent on your region, but can you give us some examples of some good hummingbird attracting plants?
I can tell you in Texas, because I'm with Texas. Here in Texas, we have things like the salvias are going to be great. We have things like firecracker fern or cigar plants. Those are going to be great. Hummingbirds are going to really go for those more trumpet-shaped flowers. So you can look for those things like honeysuckle. The coral honeysuckle that we have down here is really attractive to them, or esperanza is another one. Just look for that flower shape and it should be good to go if you get that longer tube-like flower shape on your flower.
That's a real good answer. Our next question is, I have a rain barrel to catch roof runoff. Can I use this untreated water to create a bath for the butterflies?
Yes, you can, but it also depends on what may be coming off of your roof. So if you have any tar or anything like that, then that you might want to use just like, I just use water from the hose. And like I said, just mix it in with the compost and stuff like that. I don't think that they're going to be too terribly picky with the rainwater, because they're going to be drinking the rainwater that they get from wherever anyway. It just depends on, you know, how old or new your roof is and what may be coming down into your rain barrel.
Yeah, so it's probably better to be safer than sorry and just use your hose water for that. Okay, here's the next question. Will mosquito dunks or pellets in the water for bees, for mosquitoes, affect the bees? So can you put those mosquito dunks in your water? When will it harm the bees?
So the mosquito dunks are going to be a bacteria that targets mosquitoes and I think midges and black flies. So they should not affect the other insects, but you are hopefully going to be changing your water out every several days anyway. A lot of times when you have these more shallow dishes, they dry out fast enough that you really don't have to worry about that 3-day time period for the mosquitoes anyway. So it really is a non-issue.
Okay, we've got a lot of questions here. So the next is, I have 2 different species of pawpaw which flower but never fruit. How do I help find the appropriate pollinators for those flowers?
They have 2 species of what flower?
Pawpaw. It's a native.
Oh, okay, the fruit. Yes. I would suggest that you go to the wildflower.org and do in their search button. You should be able to find that plant, and then it may give you an idea of what is feeding on it. If not, you can certainly go to your local extension service, and they should be able to give you an idea of the area that you're in, what pollinators would be in your area that would be attracted to that.
That's a good answer. How about, will leaving the food out be a concern for attracting bears?
Oh, wow. Possibly. It depends on what food you're leaving out, but yes, it certainly could, because food is food and bears need to eat too. So if you are concerned about things like bears, then I would certainly forego the fruit items and just do a puddling dish for your butterflies.
Yeah, we don't have bears in my area, thank goodness. Okay, here's one, and this is one that I hear every time we do a pollinator talk. It's, what are your feelings about carpenter bees, seeing as they do some serious damage to homes?
I think that carpenter bees that are nesting in areas that are natural are fantastic, but when they are nesting in structural areas that we do not want them, that is when they turn into a quote-unquote pest. So when we're talking about insects and integrated pest management, a pest is pretty much something that's out of place. It's in an area where you don't want it. And so you can certainly deter them from nesting in the wood that you don't want them nesting in by either treating the wood with a borate of some sort, or you can paint it or do polyurethane or something to make that less attractive for them. And then, you know, give them a good area to nest in. So you can leave some large logs like way back in the back of your yard, away from whatever area that you don't want them nesting in.
Right, we're getting some information about pawpaw here. It says that pawpaws need flies to pollinate, and so the zebra swallowtail caterpillars feed on pawpaw. So does anybody else have any more questions for Wizzie? It's been a really good presentation today.
Thank you.
I don't see any more questions coming in. So the next webinar is going to be on August 3rd. It's the first Friday in August, and it's going to be bees, wasps, and hornets. Oh my. So we hope that you can join us for that. And we thank you for all the information, Wizzie.
Thank you very much.
Hope everybody has
Thank you everyone for participating.
All right, everybody have a good day.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you, guys.